I'm Kim McIntosh, and I teach biology at Shadow Mountain High School in Phoenix, Arizona. And this presentation is about the chemistry of life, so we're going to be talking quite a bit about carbon compounds. Cells are made up of large molecules called biomolecules, and the basic atom of these large molecules is carbon. And carbon is very important. It can form covalent bonds with as many as 4 other atoms. So some very large molecules can be formed by carbon, and every living thing is made with carbon atoms. So we're going to start off with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is a macromolecule. You've probably heard of carbs before. Carbohydrates are used by our body for energy. Our body uses them for structure and support. And these carbohydrates are molecules. They're made of sugars. Carbohydrates can also be in some other complex molecules like chitin and cellulose. So we see this with like the body of insects is made of chitin, and then cellulose is in the cell walls of plants, and so that gives them their structure. Another macromolecule is lipids. Lipids are fats, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. And these are chains of carbon atoms that are bonded to each other, and they're bonded to hydrogen as well. And because of the way that they're bonded, they repel water. And you can see that right up here in this phospholipid bilayer. So what they have is part of it is hydrophilic, which means it loves water, and this other part here, this tail looking part, is hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't like water. So that combination will keep liquids from flowing through that layer. So another important aspect is that fats can store energy. Then we have proteins, and proteins are chains of amino acids, and their shape, the shape of the protein, determines what the protein does. And if you look at this picture here, you'll see that protein is an extremely important part of our body. So our hair and nails are made out of protein. There's a hemoglobin protein that's in your blood. Our brains and our nerves, they control signaling using proteins. We have lots of enzymes that use protein. Our cellular construction workers, so the clusters of proteins that do the work in our cells. Muscles have proteins called actin and myosin, and that allows for muscle movement. Cellular messengers are receptor proteins, so they have a hugely important job. And then antibodies, the proteins that help us guard against getting sick or guard against invaders in our bodies, all made of proteins. So let's talk about amino acids, because amino acids are what makes up the proteins. So amino acids, they all have this amino group and a carboxyl group. All right, so what that means is that the units of amino acids, they form these links called peptide bonds, and then the side group, so like what you see here, this R is the side group, and that's what gives the amino acid its unique properties. Okay, so we'll always see this basic structure in an amino acid, but the side group here will be different, and that's what makes it unique. All right, so proteins have different structures, different ways that they are formed, and that gives them their unique properties. So the first thing we see is the primary structure. So that would be right here, and that is just the way the amino acids are arranged. So you have one type of amino acid, let's call it A, and then the next one might be B, and then we might have another A, and then we might have C, and these are all different kinds of amino acids. And there's 20 different kinds of amino acids, but because of this arrangement, it can be a different arrangement. We can have thousands of different proteins. All right, the next thing is the secondary structure. So that's what you would see right here. This is the secondary structure, and this is how it's going to fold. Okay, so you see this one is kind of folded back and forth. Well, that would be its secondary structure. The third thing is its tertiary structure. So here you see that not only is it folded, but it's kind of wrapped around itself too. And then the last one is the quaternary structure. And quaternary is basically when you have a set of proteins. And it doesn't just have to be two, it can be multiple proteins, but they're together, and that forms their quaternary structure. All right, the next macromolecule that we're going to talk about is nucleic acids. These are long chains of nucleotide units. Ones you've probably heard of before are base pairs. So nucleic acids are always made of a sugar. So down on this side, you see this is the sugar. And then you have a base. So right here, you would have this base. And then you have the phosphate groups. So here's the phosphate groups that we have. All right, so this shows ATP. This is basically the energy molecule in our cells, and it's really just a nucleic acid. Over here, these would be the bases that form the DNA. And we're going to talk about those in a lot of detail later in the course. Okay, moving right along, we're still talking about the chemistry of life, and this one is about energy and metabolism. All right, let's talk about the way that matter can change. So all living things are made of matter, but changes occur constantly in that matter. And there's two different types of changes. There's physical changes, which would change the form or the shape. So our best example of this is water. We can have water in the liquid form. We can have water in the ice form. We can also have water in the gas form. So that would be kind of the humidity that's in the air around us. And those are all physical changes of water. In each case, it's still water, but it's just in a different form. Chemical changes are quite a bit different than physical changes, because chemical changes, they actually change the substance into a different substance. All right, so if we look at this egg right here, this egg's being fried, and it's changing the chemical composition of the egg. So when we first crack it and we put it in the pan, we see that we have the yolk and we have the other liquid part of the egg. And when we cook it, they change. That liquid part turns white, it gets harder. If we cook it long enough, the yolk gets harder. And a really good indication that that's a chemical change is that we cannot go back from this cooked egg to the original egg that we had in the shell. We can't get it back from one to the other. We have this law of conservation of mass, and that simply means that matter is neither created or destroyed when there's a chemical reaction. That's shown really well right here. We have a calcium chloride, and along with that we have a sodium sulfate solution. So you notice the calcium chloride's in the test tube, sodium sulfate is in the beaker. 300.23 grams of substance in this beaker. Turn it over, mix it up, put the two solutions in there together, and what we end up with is we have a calcium sulfate, which is a white precipitate in this sodium chloride solution. But notice, this is the important part, we still have 300.23 grams of substance. So even though there was a chemical reaction, it's no more or no less than what we started with. Right, energy is the ability to move or change matter. Every chemical reaction requires energy. Every physical change requires energy. And we have a law about that energy. We have the law of conservation of energy. And this just means that energy can change from one form to another, but the total amount of energy does not change. All right, we're going to talk about chemical reactions. These are required to change a substance from one form to another. And what happens in a chemical reaction is that bonds between atoms are broken and new bonds are formed. And all living things need chemical reactions in order to get the energy required for life's processes. So without chemical reactions, we would not be alive because our body is performing thousands and thousands and thousands of chemical reactions at all times. So a chemical reaction involves reactants. Those are the substances that is changed. So the reactants would be shown here. They're always on the left-hand side of the reaction arrow. And then we have products, and that would be the new substance that is formed after the chemical reaction. And it's always shown to the right of that reaction arrow. All right, we have activation energy, and this is a really important concept for us because chemical reactions require a certain amount of energy, and the minimum amount of energy required is called the activation energy. So you have to have this minimum before the reaction is going to happen. If you don't reach that activation energy mark, you won't have the chemical reaction happen. And in biological reactions, we have to have a lot of chemical reactions between these large, complex biomolecules, which means that it requires a large activation energy. There has to be this certain amount of energy before the chemical reaction would happen. And because that is a large amount of energy, we have enzymes, and they help overcome this problem. So how do they do that? Well, the enzymes, they speed up chemical reactions, and the way that they do that is they lower the activation energy that's needed. So like up here, you'll see here, this reaction needs this much energy up here. But if we have the enzyme, it lowers that amount of activation energy that's needed. It brings it down to here. This helps these reactions occur much quicker. So let's talk about what exactly is happening with an enzyme. So an enzyme has what we call an active site. You'll see that here. This entire little segment right here is the active site, and it looks just like a puzzle piece. And what happens is a substrate comes along, and the substrate is the matching puzzle piece. So the substrate locks in here, and it changes the formation of the enzyme, and that causes the reaction to occur. And then after the reaction, the enzyme returns to its original shape, and it's ready to go again. An important concept about enzymes is that they're not used up in the reaction. So the substrate comes along, it locks in to where it's supposed to be, then the reaction occurs. After the reaction, the enzyme goes back to its original shape, and it's ready for a new substrate and ready to make the reaction occur again. So one of the things about enzymes that's really important is that it will only work if it's the correct shape. So it is definitely like a puzzle piece. It has to have the correct shape for the substrate to fit into. And we know that temperature and pH changes can affect the shape of enzymes. And once that shape is affected, it makes it unable to do its job. All right, so we're going to talk about metabolism. Metabolism is the process of energy generation and use within your cells. So cells get energy by breaking down food molecules, and that process uses a lot of enzymes. And then the energy that's formed is in the form of an ATP molecule, and that is what the cells use. They kind of hold on to those ATP molecules, and whenever they need to use energy, they use the ATP. And that is the last of that.